Welcome, classmates. My name is Tracy Spaur, and I am this week's guinea pig for the video presentation of John Chrysostom. So let me humbly shrink myself into the corner and begin. I'd like to use Edmund Venerable's outline, and he outlines the life, first of all, as a layman in Antioch, then as an ascetic in a monastery, his ministry in Antioch, his episcopate in Constantinople, and then finally his exile. So let's use that outline. First of all, looking at Antioch, we see he was born in 347. Some scholars disagree. His father died when he was an infant. He was raised by his single mom, and she was a very devout Christian. She had him tutored in rhetoric by Libanius, and he graduated from that tutoring and actually became a lawyer first, but he was vexed with the moral compromises that required, and so he answered God's call to ministry. And in doing that, he then was baptized and ordained as a church reader. Then as an ascetic, he entered a monastery and practiced very strict ascetics of the Pachamonian rule. And during this time, he learned under Diodorus of Tarsus, who was the Antiochene school of hermeneutics, which we'll talk about that more later on. But that's where he learned that way of interpreting Scripture. He practiced such strict ascetic rigors that he damaged his health and had to leave the monastery. So as we look at his Antioch ministry, we see he was ordained as a deacon and then 3 years later as a priest and began his writing and preaching ministry. He became a very eloquent preacher, and crowds would pack into the auditorium and break into loud applause. His sermons were so exhilarating. Well, his reputation as a great preacher earned him the nickname Golden Mouth, which is the meaning of Chrysostom. But that nickname was given to him 150 years after his death. So he never really heard that name. He was known as John of Antioch during his lifetime. Well, 11 years of ministry in Antioch were ended when he was drafted as the bishop of Constantinople. When the previous bishop passed away, the civil head of the state church, whose name was Eutrophius, wanted John, as the best orator in Christianity, to take that post. Well, in 398, Eutrophius ordered imperial troops to kidnap John from Antioch. And so John accepted this as God's providence. Well, during this time, his position required him to deal with various groups that were vying for power. But John was very different from the previous, his predecessors. He shunned the grand banquets and the political elite. He continued his ascetic lifestyle and shunned luxury and ate in privacy. In fact, he sold all of the lavish church furnishings and gave the money to the hospitals in the city. So his confrontational preaching and his sharp tongue and his unwillingness to be pandered, all of these things together caused him to have a lot of enemies. So after 5 years, he finally offended Empress Eudoxia and was exiled. The first exile lasted only a couple of days. The second exile actually led to his death, and we'll get into these aspects a little deeper later on. Well, his significance and contributions are as a preacher. He is a leading candidate for the most remarkable yet unknown figure in church history. He is said by Don Atwater to be probably the greatest preacher who ever lived. So Chrysostom was trained, first of all, in rhetoric. And so he saw that as the foundation of good preaching. He seriously criticized those who did not respect the importance of Christian rhetoric. His primary concern was practical application for evangelism or exhortation. It was not about deep scriptural exegete. He was a pastor. He was a preacher. He was not so much a theologian. So his sermons demonstrate the centrality of the scriptural text in the homiletical tradition. And he saw the Bible as the universal panacea, the panacopia to the needs of everyone. Well, he preached to transform, in other words. And you can see that in his works. He has more than 620 of his sermons survive, and 242 of his letters. So when you look at the total extant works, they are really more voluminous than any other church father. For example, he wrote commentaries of, it is said, of every book in the Bible. However, most of his Old Testament commentaries are missing. He wrote treatises on subjects such as priesthood and monastic life. However, he wrote no systematic theology, such as Thomas Aquinas and his Summa Theologiae. Now, for Catholics, they like him, and the Orthodox like him, because of his teachings that are supportive of the doctrine of transubstantiation. And they also like the Eucharistic liturgies that he worked on and wrote. Most of them are used by the Roman Catholics in their Mass. And one of the works is entitled The Divine Liturgy of Our Father Among the Saints, John Chrysostom. So Protestants, however, point to his literal hermeneutics. He was the primary representative of the Antiochene exegesis. That exegetical school taught that you should look for the exact and literal meaning in your hermeneutics, whereas the Alexandrian exegesis was looking for the underlying allegorical meaning. So the Alexandrian view prevailed until the Protestant Reformation, and they revived the Antiochene view, and then esteemed Chrysostom as the church father, second only to Augustine. Now let's look at the empire and the church, and we see that they were closely entwined during that time. I'd like to illustrate that, showing you 10 situations where the powers of the empire and the powers of the church intersect. So first of all, I'd like to look at back at Antioch when he was there. There was a tax riot because a new tax was levied to pay for the security forces, and the people rioted. Well, Chrysostom was able to calm the people down, and he was able to help the empire because the civil unrest was calmed down. Well, secondly, the second situation is when the empire drafted Chrysostom to his position as the Bishop of Constantinople, because they thought of this position as one that they could politically manipulate. Well, Chrysostom was a powerful influence, and this was demonstrated when Eutrophius got into deadly trouble with the empress and fled to Chrysostom for his life and fled for sanctuary. Well, Chrysostom publicly rebuked Eutrophius, and then he negotiated with Emperor Arcadia for an exile for him. A second example of his influence was when the Goth mercenary army was camped near the city. The Goth commander insisted on having a more prestigious governmental position. So he took 3 prominent hostages of the governmental officials and threatened to overtake the city. Well, Chrysostom intervened with the commander and secured the release of the hostages and diffused the crisis for the empire. Well, on the other hand, Empress Eudoxia was increasingly offended by Chrysostom's uncompromising preaching and sharp tongue. So when Chrysostom was away for a few months, there was political corruption that flourished. And when John returned, he was enraged, and he publicly rebuked everyone that was involved, including making an oblique comparison of Empress Eudoxia to the biblical Jezebel. Well, that didn't go over well. And so she started to look for ways to get revenge, and she found that in the help of the jealous bishop of Alexandria. So here we see the empire playing one metropolitan bishop against another metropolitan bishop. And so they did this through getting Theophilus to bring a group of Egyptian bishops up to Constantinople, and they there formed a general church, a church council. Well, this was in 403, and they met in a place outside of Chalcedon called the Oak, and this is where they get the name Senate at the Oak. Well, Theophilus brought up these trumped-up charges against Chrysostom. Chrysostom refused to attend the illegitimate council, and nevertheless, the council deposed Chrysostom, and the empress immediately and gladly exiled him. Well, a riot broke out the next day following, and there was also a freakish earthquake that shook the actual bedroom of Eudoxia. Well, she freaked out, thought this to be God's message, his warning to her, and so she reversed the exile, brought Chrysostom back. Well, there was a citywide celebration. They brought Chrysostom on their shoulders back to the cathedral and placed him back on the throne. Well, the empress and Chrysostom then reconciled. Well, sadly, this reconciliation did not last very long, because Eudoxia decided to erect a statue of herself in front of the St. Sophia Cathedral. Well, as you can imagine, Chrysostom was not happy about this, and he publicly condemned Eudoxia. And then she went back into the rage mode, and with the help of Theophilus, they found an obscure church law that banned the reinstatement of a bishop once they had been deposed by a church council. So we see the empire using church law and church enemies to depose a bishop. Well, another riot broke out, and this time the church mysteriously was set on fire. So from exile, we have Chrysostom writing letters. He wrote hundreds of letters during this time, encouraging believers and trying to get himself reinstated. Meanwhile, back at the city, the empire was trying to force believers to receive communion from Chrysostom's replacement under the threat of fine and imprisonment. They were deposing clergy and banishing them and persecuting people. Well, Chrysostom appealed to the Pope in a letter asking him for a legitimate call to a general church council. The letter was sent. However, anti-Chrysostom governmental officials refused to deliver the letter to the emperor. So after 3 years of exile, the emperor ordered Chrysostom to be force-marched to the most severe and remote place in the empire and to forbid all communications. Well, under this cruel treatment, Chrysostom died in 407. So there you have John Chrysostom, a strong preacher of the gospel, unwilling to be manipulated by the empire, deposed, exiled, and martyred. So John Chrysostom had his day with the empire, and the empire won. Thank you.